It began long before the first gunshot echoed across Spain in July 1936. Historians often say that the Spanish Civil War erupted suddenly, triggered by a military uprising, but the truth is far more layered and dramatic. Spain was a nation simmering like a closed pot for years, its internal pressures rising day by day until finally the lid blew off. To understand why Europe became entangled in Spain's catastrophe, and why Hitler and Mussolini spotted an opportunity there, we must step back into a country struggling to break free from its past while being dragged down by its own demons. In the early 20th century, Spain was a fading empire. Once the master of vast territories, it had long lost its global influence. What remained at home was a troubled society, deeply religious in some regions and fiercely secular in others, modern in the cities but feudal in the countryside, wealthy in its elite class yet desperately poor among its farmers and workers. The monarchy, once a symbol of stability, had become weak and unpopular. Every attempt at reform seemed to anger one half of the population and disappoint the other. The turning point came in 1931, when municipal elections delivered a shocking verdict. Even though they were only local elections, their results revealed the public's overwhelming desire for change. King Alfonso XIII, sensing widespread dissatisfaction, chose to leave the country rather than face a divided population. His departure marked the beginning of the Second Spanish Republic, a moment that many celebrated with hope. Crowds gathered in the streets, cheering for what they believed would be a new era of freedom, justice, and modernization. The new government wasted no time embarking on ambitious reforms. It aimed to separate the church from the state, redistribute land to the landless, reform the military, promote education, empower women, and modernize the political structure. For many ordinary Spaniards, especially workers, intellectuals, and the poor, these changes were a long-awaited promise of a better future. To them, Spain finally seemed ready to catch up with the rest of Europe. But every reform came with a cost. The Catholic Church, deeply rooted in Spanish identity, felt attacked by secular policies. Wealthy landowners feared losing their estates to redistribution. The military saw restructuring as an insult to its honor and a threat to its influence. Conservatives, monarchists, and traditionalists believed the Republic was dismantling Spain's values. On the opposite end, many left-wing groups thought the reforms were moving far too slowly. Socialists demanded more economic change, anarchists rejected the entire political structure, and communists aimed for revolutionary transformation. Spain became polarized, its two halves drifting further apart with each passing month. The 1933 elections swung the pendulum back to the right. A conservative coalition took power and quickly reversed many of the Republic's reforms. Tension soared as both sides felt betrayed whenever the other governed. The political climate grew toxic. Street brawls, riots, and political assassinations became increasingly common. Extremist militias marched openly, each convinced they were defending Spain from destruction. Violence reached a disturbing peak in 1934, when the left-wing uprising in Asturias erupted. Miners in the region, frustrated by conservative rule, took up arms. The government responded with brutal military force, leaving thousands dead and entire towns scarred. Asturias deepened the national divide. The left saw the government as tyrannical, while the right viewed the uprising as proof that Spain was on the brink of communist revolution. When new elections were held in 1936, the left-wing Popular Front won by a narrow margin. Celebrations once again filled the streets, but beneath the joy lurked fear. Conservatives believed Spain was slipping into chaos, leftists believed they had rescued democracy from the edge. Instead of calming the nation, the election intensified the political firestorm. Land seizures increased, far-right groups grew bolder, and clashes between rival factions grew deadlier. Spain felt like a country walking toward a cliff. Among those watching this chaos closely were Spain's military leaders. Many of them had long been suspicious of the Republic, but now they believed decisive action was necessary. They secretly planned a coordinated military uprising to save the country. One of the central figures was General Francisco Franco. Known for his strict discipline and conservative beliefs, Franco had risen steadily through the ranks. Although he was not initially the most prominent conspirator, he became a key voice in the developing plot. The spark that finally ignited the fuse came in July 1936 with the assassination of José Calvo Sotelo, a major right-wing politician. He was abducted and killed by leftist police officers seeking revenge for the earlier murder of a socialist lieutenant. The government did not order the killing, but the damage was done. It confirmed the right's worst fears and convinced the military that Spain had indeed descended into lawlessness. The generals moved quickly. On July 17, 1936, the uprising began in Spanish Morocco and soon spread to the mainland. What the generals expected to be a swift coup instead turned into a full-scale civil war. Spain split almost instantly into two camps. On one side were the nationalists, led eventually by Franco, supported by conservatives, monarchists, the church, and right-wing militias. On the other side were the Republicans, a diverse coalition of liberals, socialists, communists, and anarchists, supported by workers, intellectuals, and minority regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country. Both sides were passionate, determined, and convinced that the fate of Spain and even the fate of Europe depended on their victory. Outside Spain, the world watched with anxious curiosity. To many observers, the conflict was more than a civil war. It seemed like the first major confrontation between rising fascist forces and the defenders of democracy. Newspapers across Europe reported the fighting with dramatic headlines, warning that Spain might be the testing ground for a far larger conflict. And they were right. Hitler and Mussolini soon saw in Spain a perfect opportunity, a chance to expand their influence, test their military strength, and support a friendly regime. Spain had not just stumbled into civil war, it had opened the door to forces that would soon set the entire world ablaze. Hitler's strategic gamble: Germany enters the conflict. When the Spanish Civil War erupted, the world was astonished by how quickly the conflict expanded beyond Spain's borders. Yet one man, sitting hundreds of miles away in Berlin, understood the opportunity almost instantly. Adolf Hitler, only 3 years into his rule over Germany, watched Spain's collapse with the sharp eyes of a strategist. To him, Spain was more than a distant nation in turmoil, it was a laboratory, a stage, and potentially a future ally. What unfolded over the next months was not simply foreign assistance, it was the beginning of a deadly rehearsal for the global war Hitler was preparing to unleash. When news of the Spanish military uprising reached Berlin in July 1936, Hitler did not take long to make up his mind. Even before his generals had fully assessed the situation, he sensed its strategic value. Spain's military rebels were requesting aircraft to transport their troops from Morocco to mainland Spain, a logistical challenge that threatened to sabotage the uprising before it had even begun. To Hitler, this was not a burden but an opportunity. If the rebels succeeded, Germany could gain a sympathetic regime in the southwestern corner of Europe, one that would benefit the Nazi vision of weakening democracies. Moreover, supporting a right-wing general like Francisco Franco aligned perfectly with Hitler's mission to counter communism and undermine left-wing governments. Hitler's decision was also driven by practical needs. Germany had been rearming rapidly since he came to power, but much of his military technology had not yet been tested in real combat. Spain offered an ideal testing ground, far away from German borders and political scrutiny. Sending equipment and soldiers under the banner of volunteers allowed Germany to experiment without openly provoking other European powers. In a sense, Spain became the battlefield where Hitler could test the weapons he would later deploy across Europe. Within days of receiving the nationalists' request, Hitler authorized Operation Magic Fire, a covert mission to send transport planes to ferry Franco's African troops across the Strait of Gibraltar. The arrival of these German aircraft completely transformed the early phase of the war, giving Franco's forces mobility and momentum they could never have achieved alone. Encouraged by this early success, Hitler escalated his involvement. Soon, Germany began shipping advanced fighter planes, bombers, artillery, and military advisors into Spain. But Hitler's most significant contribution came in the form of the Condor Legion, a special German air and ground force consisting of pilots, technicians, tank units, and intelligence officers. Officially, these were volunteers, but in reality, they were elite units drawn from the rapidly modernizing Luftwaffe. Their participation would become infamous throughout the war. For Germany, the Condor Legion was more than just military aid. It was an opportunity to test new aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf 109, improve bombing techniques, analyze ground attacks, and perfect coordination between air and land forces. These experiments would later fuel the devastating blitzkrieg strategies Germany used in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Spain was their rehearsal, and Hitler knew it. German intervention was not merely strategic, it was psychological. Hitler believed that European democracies were weak, indecisive, and unwilling to confront aggression. Spain allowed him to test their reaction in a controlled environment. When Britain and France chose not to intervene directly, hiding behind the non-intervention agreement, Hitler concluded that they lacked the resolve to challenge him. Their silence, in his mind, was an open invitation to push further. As German support strengthened the nationalists, the war began taking on a new tone. Franco's forces, once limited in aviation power, now had modern aircraft capable of striking deep into Republican territory. The German bombing of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937 became one of the most chilling symbols of this transformation. For the Condor Legion, Guernica was a tactical experiment in saturation bombing, targeting bridges and roads to block retreating Republican forces. But for the civilians living there, it was a nightmare. Fires engulfed the town, buildings collapsed, and hundreds were killed or injured. Images of the destruction traveled the world, and Pablo Picasso immortalized the horror in his iconic painting Guernica. The international outrage did little to stop Hitler, who simply denied responsibility and continued his support with greater confidence. Inside Germany, the Spanish conflict also served Hitler domestically. Newspapers portrayed the war as a heroic fight against communism, turning Franco into a symbol of nationalist resistance. The Nazi regime framed its involvement as a duty to protect Europe from the Red Threat, strengthening Hitler's popularity among conservative Germans. At the same time, participating in the war allowed German officers to gain real combat experience without risking a direct confrontation with major powers. For Franco, German support was invaluable, but it was not unconditional. Hitler maintained a careful distance, ensuring Franco did not become too independent or powerful. This subtle control served a purpose. Hitler wanted a friendly Spain, not a rival. He never expected Franco to become a major ally in any future war, but he wanted Spain neutral or sympathetic to German interests. Supporting the nationalists ensured that Spain would not fall into the hands of a leftist government aligned with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in Europe, reactions were mixed. Britain, skeptical of both sides, remained officially neutral, though many of its citizens sympathized with the Republic. France, politically unstable and fearful of provoking Germany, hesitated to act decisively. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans, turning Spain into a battleground of competing ideologies. But neither side matched the speed, coordination, and strategic clarity of German intervention. Hitler saw Spain as a chessboard, and he was playing several moves ahead of everyone else. By late 1937, the impact of German involvement was undeniable. Nationalist forces had gained air superiority in several regions, their ground tactics had improved, and the psychological pressure on Republican cities intensified. German pilots, now confident from real combat missions, returned home as experienced veterans. German engineers analyzed wreckage, studied weapon performance, and made improvements that would later influence the design of tanks, aircraft, and communication systems. Hitler's gamble in Spain had paid off. He had strengthened a future ally, tested his military, undermined democratic powers, and boosted his propaganda, all without provoking a major international crisis. To him, Spain was not merely a civil war, it was a strategic triumph that proved Europe was not ready to confront Nazi aggression. What neither Hitler nor the world fully realized yet was that Spain had become the first act of a much larger tragedy. The lessons Germany learned in the skies over Spain would soon be unleashed across Europe with far greater force. The Spanish Civil War was not the beginning of World War II, but it was the rehearsal that made the real drama possible. Mussolini's shadow over Spain. While Germany's involvement in Spain grew with calculated precision, another European dictator was following the conflict with a mixture of excitement and ambition. Benito Mussolini, the self-styled founder of fascism, had long imagined Italy as a Mediterranean powerhouse whose influence stretched across Europe and North Africa. The eruption of the Spanish Civil War seemed, to him, like an unexpected invitation to reshape the region according to his imperial dreams. If Hitler approached Spain like a strategist playing a cold and measured game, Mussolini plunged into the conflict with fiery enthusiasm, convinced that Franco's victory would crown Italy as the guardian of a new fascist Europe. Mussolini's eyes had been fixed on Spain even before the war began. Italy's fascist ideology had found admirers among right-wing Spanish groups, and Mussolini believed that helping a nationalist uprising would give Italy a loyal partner in the Western Mediterranean. For years, he had imagined building a vast Italian sphere of influence that could rival Britain and France. Spain, weakened by internal divisions, looked like the perfect place to extend that influence. The moment Franco's generals launched their revolt, Mussolini sensed a chance to leap into the heart of the conflict and reshape history. At first, Franco approached Italy cautiously. He needed help but worried that asking foreign powers too openly would expose the weakness of his revolt. But the scale of the rebellion demanded support far greater than what his own forces could provide. He soon realized that without outside help, the nationalists would struggle to match the Republican side's access to industry and international volunteers. So he sent an urgent request to Rome. Mussolini, eager to seize an opportunity before Hitler dominated the scene completely, responded almost instantly. Unlike Berlin's measured approach, Rome moved with boldness and speed. Within days, Mussolini ordered aircraft, weapons, and ammunition to be sent to Franco's forces. But the Italian leader wanted more than to send supplies, he wanted Italian boots on Spanish soil. For him, this was not a covert operation but a dramatic display of fascist solidarity. Soon, thousands of Italian volunteers began arriving, soldiers drawn from the regular Italian army but dressed in uniforms that gave the appearance of civilian militia. They came as part of the Corpo Truppe Volontari, a force that eventually grew far larger than anything Germany deployed. Mussolini's intervention was driven by a mix of ideology, ambition, and insecurity. He hoped that a fascist Spain would strengthen Italy's role in Europe, giving him the prestige he desperately needed. At the same time, he feared that the rise of communism in Spain could inspire similar movements in Italy. By supporting Franco, Mussolini believed he was defending not only Europe from left-wing expansion but also his own regime from potential internal threats. The Spanish conflict became a symbolic battleground where he could prove that fascism was the rising force of the continent. While Hitler sent advanced aircraft to test new technologies, Mussolini sent sheer numbers troops, tanks, artillery, pilots, and specialists in large formations. Italian involvement dramatically shifted the balance of ground power in several early campaigns. Towns that had resisted Franco's forces for weeks fell within days when Italian troops arrived. The nationalist command welcomed this reinforcement, though privately some officers grumbled about the Italians' lack of discipline and their sometimes outdated tactics. Still, Mussolini believed Italy's presence in Spain would serve as a grand stage to showcase Italian military power. What he did not anticipate was how quickly the war would expose the weaknesses of his army. His troops were brave but often poorly equipped compared to their German counterparts. Many Italian aircraft were outdated and struggled to compete with modern Republican fighters. These shortcomings became painfully visible in major confrontations. The Battle of Guadalajara in 1937 was the most humiliating moment for Mussolini's ambitions. His forces, advancing confidently toward Madrid, were met by determined Republican resistance and forced into a chaotic retreat. The defeat shocked Mussolini. Newspapers across Europe mocked the Italian effort, and even Hitler privately commented on the incompetence of Italy's military planning. Yet, despite the blow to his pride, Mussolini did not withdraw. Instead, he doubled down. The setback only fueled his determination to ensure a nationalist victory. He increased troop deployments, sent more aircraft, and attempted to modernize Italy's operations in Spain. Over time, Italian intervention became indispensable to Franco's advances, especially in the Mediterranean regions where Italian naval support disrupted Republican supply routes. The presence of Italian submarines in the waters around Spain added a new dimension to the conflict, threatening ships suspected of carrying aid to the Republican side. Inside Italy, Mussolini used the Spanish conflict as propaganda to unify the nation behind his vision. Newspapers portrayed Italian soldiers as heroes fighting against the spread of communism. Posters celebrated the Italian, Spanish Brotherhood and depicted Mussolini as a defender of European civilization. Although the war drained Italy's finances, the fascist propaganda machine ensured that the public saw it as a noble and necessary sacrifice. For many Italians, Spain became a distant but emotionally charged battlefield where Italy was supposedly shaping the future of Europe. For Franco, Italian support was both a blessing and a challenge. It provided the manpower and equipment he desperately needed, but it also came with strings attached. Mussolini expected influence, gratitude, and political alignment. Franco, however, was not eager to be anyone's puppet. While he accepted Italy's help, he carefully kept Mussolini at arm's length, balancing Italian support with German involvement and his own nationalist agenda. He aimed to win the war with the help of foreign powers without surrendering Spain's independence to either of them. As the conflict dragged on, the Italian role became deeply embedded in nationalist victories across Aragon, Catalonia, and the southern fronts. Italian aircraft supported ground assaults, Italian technicians repaired captured equipment, and Italian officers trained Franco's troops. By 1938, the nationalists were gaining ground steadily, and Mussolini proudly claimed that Italian fascism had played a decisive role in reversing the tide of the war. Yet, beneath the surface of these victories, Italy's involvement had long-term consequences that Mussolini failed to foresee. The war exposed the logistical vulnerabilities of the Italian military, the limitations of its industry, and the lack of coordination within its command structures. These weaknesses would resurface painfully when World War II erupted. Mussolini's desire to prove Italy's strength in Spain ironically revealed how unprepared his nation was for a modern war. Still, in the Spanish conflict, Mussolini never wavered. He saw every setback as proof that greater effort was needed, every victory as justification for even deeper involvement. By the time the war neared its end, Italy had sent tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of aircraft, and mountains of weapons, far more than any other foreign power. Mussolini had invested so much in Spain that even neutral states began to associate the nationalist cause with Italian fascism as much as with Franco himself. By helping Franco, Mussolini believed he was shaping the destiny of Spain. What he did not realize was that Spain was also shaping the destiny of fascist Italy, exposing its ambitions, testing its limits, and setting the stage for the far larger disaster that awaited Europe only a few years later. The war's turning tide and the legacy Spain left behind. As the Spanish Civil War dragged into its third year, the lines of battle began to shift in ways that revealed much more than military strategy. By 1938, Spain had become a mirror held up to Europe, reflecting the continent's growing fractures and the anxieties lurking beneath its political surface. While Hitler and Mussolini had both entered the conflict with different motives, their combined influence had reshaped the war so deeply that Spain's internal struggle no longer belonged only to Spaniards. The country had become the stage upon which the world's rival ideologies tested their strength. And behind the thunder of artillery and the drone of aircraft, the larger question loomed at every turn: what would remain once the smoke cleared? The Republican side, despite its early enthusiasm, found itself squeezed by circumstances beyond its control. Its supporters came from diverse political backgrounds: socialists, communists, anarchists, liberals, each with their own vision of Spain's future. These differences, once managed through uneasy cooperation, became increasingly difficult to suppress as the war turned against them. Supply shortages frustrated commanders, internal arguments slowed decision-making, and the Soviet Union's support, while crucial, came with political strings that deepened tensions within the coalition. In contrast, the nationalist side projected unity. Franco's leadership was firm, decisive, and unchallenged. The foreign support he received flowed more smoothly, and his troops advanced with growing confidence. By winter 1938, the nationalists had carved Spain almost in two, isolating Republican territories and cutting supply lines. Franco moved methodically, avoiding reckless charges and focusing on weakening his enemy through steady advances. Each captured town not only expanded his control but also sent waves of psychological pressure across Republican regions. Civilians fled by the thousands, seeking safety wherever they could find it, even though such places were growing scarce. The sight of long columns of refugees moving slowly along rural roads became one of the war's defining images. Foreign correspondents who traveled across Spain during this period described a nation exhausted from within. Factories had slowed to a crawl, farms could no longer produce enough food, and homes that once echoed with daily life now stood shattered by bombings or abandoned entirely. Even the weather seemed to play a role. Harsh winters and dry summers deepened the misery of soldiers on both sides. Yet amid all this devastation, the determination of ordinary people remained astonishing. Some formed local militias, others worked in underground workshops repairing weapons, while many more hid families, friends, and neighbors who feared persecution no matter which side might reach them first. Meanwhile, in the capitals of Europe, diplomats watched Spain's agony with a mixture of caution and dread. Britain and France, still determined to avoid another large-scale war, clung stubbornly to their policy of non-intervention, even as it became clear that the conflict had already grown beyond Spain's borders. The League of Nations issued statements, held debates, and organized committees, but its efforts lacked the authority or unity needed to influence events on the ground. The inability of Europe's democracies to act decisively strengthened the belief in Berlin and Rome that they could pursue their ambitions without serious consequences. Spain, unintentionally, had become the testing ground not only for military weapons but also for the political will of nations. As 1939 dawned, the Republican position crumbled further. Barcelona, long considered one of the strongest centers of resistance, fell in January after relentless pressure. The loss stunned the Republic but did not break its spirit immediately. Leaders attempted to reorganize their forces and negotiate for foreign assistance, but their pleas found little response. Many had hoped that the Western democracies would eventually step in once they realized the scale of fascist intervention, but that day never came. Instead, the Republic faced the grim reality that it was running out of time, supplies, and territory. In Madrid, the last major Republican stronghold, the atmosphere grew tense as Franco's forces closed in. The city had endured sieges, bombings, and internal struggles for nearly 3 years. Its people were worn by hunger and fear, yet there remained a quiet determination that had defined the city since the first days of the war. Even so, resolve alone could not stop the inevitable. Nationalist forces surrounded the capital gradually, tightening their grip with every passing week. Republican leaders debated whether to fight until the last breath or to surrender in hopes of sparing civilians from further suffering. The debates grew bitter, reflecting the fractures that had always existed within the movement. When Madrid finally fell in March 1939, the war came to a swift and decisive end. Franco's victory was complete, and Spain entered a new era, one shaped not by the dreams of democracy that had started the decade but by the stern rule of a man who now had absolute control. The dictator's triumph brought a sense of relief to some Spaniards who longed for order after years of violence, but it also marked the beginning of a long and repressive regime. People suspected of supporting the Republic faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. Families were torn apart, communities were silenced, and the wounds left by the war lingered for generations. Outside Spain, the world absorbed the lessons of the conflict with an uneasy awareness. Hitler and Mussolini had succeeded in turning the war into a demonstration of fascist strength, and their confidence reached new heights. The ease with which they had influenced Spain and the limited response from Europe's democracies emboldened them for future ambitions. The weapons tested in Spanish skies, the tactics refined on Spanish fields, and the political boldness rehearsed in Spanish diplomacy would all return in more terrifying forms when World War II erupted later that same year. Yet the legacy of the Spanish Civil War cannot be measured only in terms of future conflicts. It also revealed the power of international solidarity. Volunteers from dozens of countries had traveled to Spain to defend the Republic, forming the international brigades. Though they could not turn the tide of war, their spirit left an enduring mark on history. Writers, doctors, students, and workers fought side by side, driven by the belief that defending Spain meant defending the future of freedom itself. Their sacrifice became a symbol of global resistance to tyranny. Spain, meanwhile, emerged from the war devastated but not defeated as a people. Towns rebuilt slowly, families began to heal, and though Franco's rule cast a long shadow, the memory of the struggle remained alive in whispered stories and hidden songs. The war had torn the nation apart, but it also revealed the resilience of its citizens. And while the guns of Spain eventually fell silent, The echoes of the conflict traveled far beyond its borders, warning the world of what happens when nations allow division to fester and when the powerful exploit the suffering of the vulnerable. In the end, the Spanish Civil War became more than a prelude to a larger catastrophe. It stood as a tragic reminder that the fate of a single country can shape the destiny of continents. Spain's pain foreshadowed Europe's future, and its downfall marked the moment when the world might have stopped a coming disaster but chose instead to look away.